So for most people, if you can kind of communicate and get by in a language, then you speak that language. But for a linguist, you have to have essentially a native-like competence and be able to formulate judgments about language and essentially use language as if it's your first. And in that sense, we'd say we don't speak that many languages. Now for North American languages, that's my element of focus. These languages have been the object of study ever since people knew that these people existed. Ever since Europeans knew that these people existed. So here's an example of a reference grammar from 1660, John Eliot's Grammar of Massachusetts, the tribe after which the state was named. And he was a missionary, and he was trying to preach to the Massachusetts and convert them to Puritanism. And he decided to do that effectively by learning their language and preaching to them in their language and teaching them in their language. And so he also wrote these guides so that other people could do the same thing. Interestingly enough, he also made tools for the Massachusetts themselves to use. And one of them was a Bible. It turns out that the first Bible printed in the United States was in the Massachusetts language. It was not in English. Those Bibles were included, I guess. But at every step of the way, as linguistics has grown into a field, the study of North American languages has greatly influenced each time, usually by shaking up what we thought we knew. People come up with a theory based on easily accessible languages like English or German or French or Japanese, and we develop these theories. We try to figure out how the buffet works, right? And then someone says, "Oh, let's look at American languages," and then it's a whole different set of dishes, and now we have to figure things out again. And that's happened over and over again, and some of the things that I do as well. And so when we look at these languages, right, it tells us something about the buffet, but the buffet is us. So when we learn about how these languages work, we're learning about how human minds work. Because anything that happens in one language, that means it happens in certain people's minds. And that means that it's possible in everyone else's mind. So when we learn something about, say, switch reference, we have a question. Well, if Kiowa has it, then why doesn't English have it? Our brains are capable of it. And so figuring out these languages turns out to be a crucial component in understanding how human minds work. Moreover, each one encodes a history. People often think that language shapes the way you think and restricts the way you think. That's not actually true. But what it does do is it reflects a history of usage, of culture. And every language that we lose means losing a piece of that culture. And so we lose a bit of ourselves each time. Now, for documentation itself, linguists have played a crucial role in trying to preserve these elements of information ever since the 1830s. And in the 1930s, the standard technique was developed to write a reference grammar. So this is essentially a list of the structures, an organized list of the structures and processes that the language uses. This is not something you can really learn a language from. It's designed for other linguists, but you can use it as the basis to build pedagogical material. So reference grammar, a dictionary, and then texts, collections of actual usage. So linguists will make these kinds of materials. Increasingly, we're putting them online so that they can be accessed anywhere by anyone at any time. That said, some communities don't want their materials put online or made accessible. And this is a question that's come up in the linguistics of North America. That a sense of ownership, that people owns their language. It might sound a little odd to us, but it's something that we encounter in a number of tribes. That some tribes do not want to share their language with outsiders. Sometimes it's just for, say, ceremonial purposes. Right? There are certain sacred words they don't want in print because then you're not supposed to say them. Or in the case of Kiowa, there are certain stories that you're only supposed to tell during the wintertime, at night. But then if you put them in a book, then they're available all the time. Some communities go further and close off all access to outsiders. So for instance, the Prairie Band Potawatomi here in Kansas, they've developed some materials, but if you're not a tribal member and you don't go to the tribal center, you can't access those materials. They won't let you do it. And this becomes an issue for linguists because as academics, part of our job is to publish what we find, right? And so if we can't publish what we find, that makes it hard for us to actually do the work that helps the communities out. And so you end up with this kind of negotiation. And agencies and universities and granting agencies and so forth are still working out how to navigate those. The Kiowas, though, have always been wide open about that. Kiowas have always been happy to share, happy to work with outside people, and curious about how the language works. And so for the Kiowa, it's always been a bit different that way. But no matter how the community works, though, linguists have shifted in the last 40 years or so to work with communities rather than working on them. And this has meant a major difference in how linguists do business. So we don't just go to a community, mine people for data, and go home. Right? We develop these relationships and actually get involved in community life as much as we can. So here's an example of some of the things that I've been doing. But around the world, although especially in the US, these kinds of forces that are destroying language are starting to be reversed. So we're starting to see languages become revitalized. Some people did it on their own. So there's a case of a Wampanoag lady who had a dream, and her ancestors told her in this dream that she should bring her language back. It was dormant at the time. So she went to MIT, got a PhD in linguistics, came back and revised these materials, developed materials, and revitalized her language. She brought it back. And she even has transmitted now to her children. So now her children are the first native speakers of Wampanoag in over 250 years. It's strong. It's kind of a very unique kind of case. Right? More and more, though, communities are doing this at the community level. In Oklahoma, I've seen, just in the last 15 years, a huge difference where tribes have become more visible. Tribes have become more, I guess, wealthy, is the way to put it. So Oklahoma legalized casino gambling in 2006. And since then, there have been over 50 casinos built in this state, which has as many people as Kansas. But it caters to people from Texas and neighboring states, right? And the tribes have used these casinos to build capital, to invest in other businesses, and now they're starting to expand quite a bit. And so a lot of tribes are now funding very specific programs. Not to mention that the US government has changed its policies too. There's a slide about that, but essentially the US policy is now to promote the revitalization and protection of these languages and actually put some funding behind it. And so, for instance, the Kiowas have a grant from the ANA, which is a government agency, for a language nest in the Head Start. So elders will work with the preschoolers and create kind of immersion environment. That's a very common kind of technique. Some communities have gone further and developed entire curricula. So the Akwesasne in Mohawk, in the northern edge of New York and southern Canada, have a complete K-12 curriculum in Mohawk. And that has allowed people to, the young people to grow up using their language, and then as they grow into adulthood, they start having kids that speak Mohawk again. And so that's kind of the goal, the end goal here. But it starts with things like this. And this is a language fair, so it's just a simple, I guess you could say, introductory kind of event, just kind of showing, building visibility, building awareness, and building a little bit of buzz about the language program. So I participate in this each year. I help organize it. And we just have 100 or so Kiowa kids come in, they learn some Kiowa language, and they get exposed to it. And then we kind of get some of them into the Head Start program. And then what happens for the next step is something that people are starting to plan for. So when we talk about the Kiowa language, one of the things, as a linguist, what I can bring specifically is the ability to get at these finer details of the language and document them, and then convert them a bit into something that ordinary people can access. So we'll talk a little bit about the language, and you'll see why it's not so easy to revitalize the language the way it is to, say, revitalize dancing or beadwork or things like that, which are intricate in their own way. But language is hard. So the study of Kiowa has actually, the study of language has actually told us about Kiowa's prehistory. Because what we found is that the Kiowa language is strongly related to the Genoan languages, which are spoken not on the plains, but by Pueblo farmers in the Rio Grande Valley. And there's no cultural recollection of either side of having been together. But when two languages are so closely related, then we conclude that the people who speak them used to be closely related too. So at some point, they must have been together. We don't know who split, we don't know when or why. There is an old Kiowa story about two chiefs who fought over an udder, a deer udder, which was a delicacy. And they wouldn't share it, or one of them wouldn't share it, and so the other one packed up his camp and they disappeared. They moved away, and no one heard from them again. Was that an ancient recollection of this split? We don't know. But we do have stories that talk about moving north past the Anasazi cliff dwellings and through the territory of the Utes up into the Yellowstone area. And so those are pretty well recorded and preserved. But we wouldn't know that at all without this linguistic affiliation. Now, Kiowa has actually been very well documented as far as languages go, starting with J.P. Harrington, an odd anthropologist. Personally, he was an odd person. But he was also a pretty talented linguist, and he worked with a number of languages, documenting them for the U.S. Bureau of Ethnology. Laurel Watkins, professor emerita now at Colorado College, and then Daniel Harbour, who's based in the UK, have also done a lot of more recent documentary work. Watkins made a reference grammar of Kiowa. Harrington made a dictionary. No one's really published a collection of texts in a linguistic sense, but there are a lot of texts out there. And they're written in a way that is confusing, because there's no agreed upon way to write Kiowa. There are a lot of different ways, and people will fight over which one to use. oftentimes, if your ancestor made a certain one, you'll use that one. The one that I used was made by Parker McKenzie. This is Parker McKenzie with his wife. They met at a boarding school. She was Kiowa though, and so they grew up. But they didn't speak Kiowa to their kids. That said, he became a self-trained linguist and developed a writing system for the language, in part so he could write secret notes to her in class. And he developed it over the course of 50 years. And it became the most accurate writing system for Kiowa. And it's definitely the most phonologically aware. It takes into account the automatic rules and changes of the Kiowa language. And it's the one I'm most used to, because he's my great-grandfather. This is him, more like I knew him, trying to teach his writing system at the Elder Center. So he would, whenever we'd visit his house, he wouldn't let anyone leave without a Kiowa lesson. And so we'd have to learn a couple words and how to write them and so forth. So I got used to writing Kiowa this way. So for me, that's what it looks like. But for other people, they see it, use a different writing system. And that becomes a problem when you're trying to, say, set up a class. Because if you want to teach people how to read and write in Kiowa, well, whose writing system do you use? And then it actually becomes a political battle. And in Indian tribes, it's a bit like a small town when it comes to politics. Everyone knows everyone. And a lot of the divisions run generations deep. But as far as Kiowa goes, here's some things about it, some linguistic nerdy things. Essentially, it's got a lot of sounds that English doesn't have, including ejectives, which are pop sounds like. And these are consonants in Kiowa. So there's a difference between ba, which is body hair, and ba, which is the river or the moon. And there's a difference between ka, which is car, it was borrowed from English, ka, and ka, which is a knife, and so forth. There are different vowels, diphthongs, but there are also tones. So Kiowa is a tone language. The tone makes a difference. So there's a difference between saying, for instance, dehol, which is I either killed them or I killed myself, or dehol, which is I killed it. My favorite example is the word aho. Aho means thank you. Aho means kill him. Aho, aho. What's the difference? Just the tone of the O. Very slight difference. And these kinds of things make a huge difference though in Kiowa. And so, right? But if you're trying to learn this, it becomes a little tricky. So here's some other interesting things about Kiowa. There's no tense marking. So in English we have I go, I went, I walk, I walked. In Kiowa you could say em gunma, and it means he is dancing or he was dancing, either past or present. It's not specified. That doesn't mean that there's no time expression in Kiowa. Kiowas have no problem talking about time. You have a sentence like this, you arrived about that time, early yesterday morning, that's fine. But this word zan doesn't say anything past. It just says that it's happening. Instead of using tense, Kiowa will use aspect. An aspect is something that features in the buffet of almost every language, probably every language. And it essentially describes how much of the event we're talking about. So in English, you have a difference between, say, he baked a cake and he was baking a cake, right? If I say he was baking a cake when I visited, I'm not talking, I'm talking about this one moment in the middle of the cake baking. Maybe he finished it, maybe he didn't, I'm not saying. If I say he baked a cake when I visited, then I'm talking about the whole cake baking. And that's a difference in what we call aspect. In English, these sentences are both past tense. In Kiowa, you would just mark the aspect and rely on the context to get you the time. And it might seem weird not to say the tense, but the tense is actually superfluous, even in English, almost all of the time. Because tense tells us when we're talking about. Are we talking about the past? Are we talking about the present? And so forth. But here's the thing. Every conversation you're in, one of the first things we do is establish the time we're talking about. Hey, what did you do yesterday? Right? That sort of thing. So we almost always know when we're talking about. But the grammar of English makes us say it's past. The grammar of Kiowa does not. That's the only difference in that respect. Another curious thing about Kiowa, and this one has had a lot of influence on linguistics, is the inverse number system. It's hard to explain without going into the detail, but Kiowa has singular and plural, just like English, but it also has dual, so exactly two. But the nouns don't just say singular, dual, plural. Like English has cat and cats. That would be too easy. It depends on the noun. So if it's an animate being like a beaver, so you have bo doll, the doll appears on plural, 3 or more. But if it's a tree, then the same marker appears on the singular, a doll, a. If it's a tomato, then it appears on singular and plural, but not on dual. So you get all. And then if it's a rock, nothing appears at all. And so the marker doesn't say singular or plural or whatever. It says inverse. And then you have to know what kind of noun it is to get to plural and so forth. This is a feature of Kiowa and the other Tanoan languages. No other languages on earth have this kind of system. If we didn't know that, right, we wouldn't know that it's in the buffet. Right? And so, speaking of nouns, there's no case marking, so those little endings like you get in Latin or Russian or German, there's none of that. However, the word order is flexible, so you could say the young woman will bring my cat with her. And you can flip those around any way you want, and it still means the same thing. Usually, though, Kiowas we won't bother saying all of that, because you don't have to say the nouns. You can just say the verb. She'll bring it. So if there's no case marking and the flexible word order, then how do you know who's doing what? In English, we use word order. So the woman brought the cat is different from the cat brought the woman. Right? That's not the case in Kiowa.